The email came through on a Tuesday afternoon while I sat in the break room of the machine shop in Pueblo, eating a sandwich I could barely afford, the hospital bill still folded in my jacket pocket. The paper already gone soft at the creases from how many times I had unfolded it that week. It demanded $11,000 for a shoulder surgery my insurance had decided at the last minute not to cover, a number I had stopped being able to look at directly without my stomach turning over. I had been laid off from that same shop 3 weeks earlier, kept on through the end of the month out of some strange corporate mercy. Nobody at the front office ever bothered to fully explain to a man on his way out anyway. Already I was doing the math on how long my savings would last if I stretched every single dollar as far as it would go, and the answer kept coming back the same each time, which was not very far at all. The divorced lawyer was still owed nearly $4,000, and my ex-wife Rachel still needed her half of what little remained after we sold the small house we had shared together in Belmont for years. The subject line read, "Caretaker position available, remote Colorado property," and I nearly deleted it without reading further, since most of my inbox by then was scam listings promising easy money to desperate men who searched job boards at 2 in the morning. I opened it anyway, mostly out of boredom, and found a short message from a woman named Diane Castellano, her tone businesslike in a way that felt almost refreshing after so many vague and hopeful-sounding scams. She identified herself as the property manager for a family trust that owns several thousand acres above a town called Argent Falls, a place so small that I had to search for it twice before a map finally showed it to me. It sat tucked into a fold of the San Juan Mountains west of Lake City, population 81 according to the last county count, and shrinking slowly every year as the young people left for Montrose and simply never came back home. The listing described a caretaker contract running from the middle of October through the middle of April, 6 long months of near total isolation on a property the trust called Solitude Lodge, high above the timberline. It had been built in the early 1900s by a mining company and was now owned by descendants who apparently used it only a handful of weeks each summer, the rest of the year left standing empty. The duties sounded almost laughably simple, written out on paper: run the generator, keep the roads clear enough for the snowcat, walk the perimeter twice a day, and maintain what the listing vaguely called the ventilation equipment for the old mine works beneath the property. The compensation line stopped me cold. $52,000 for the full 6 months, half paid up front at signing and the other half paid only on successful completion of the entire winter contract. It also included a furnished caretaker cabin, every utility covered, and a standing arrangement with the one general store in town for groceries billed directly to the trust each and every single month. I read the listing 3 times waiting for the catch to reveal itself the way catches always eventually did in my experience. And when nothing obvious jumped out at me, I forwarded the whole thing to my sister Beth. She was the only person left in my life with enough patience to talk me through a bad decision before I actually went and made it. And she called within the hour, asking why anyone would pay that kind of money just to have a stranger sit alone in the mountains for half a year. I told her honestly that I did not know, but that $11,000 in medical debt had a strange way of making a person stop asking why and start asking only when exactly he could finally get started. Beth made me promise to call her every single week no matter what happened up there, and I promised her that easily enough, not yet understanding how hard a promise like that would become to keep once the satellite reception proved as unreliable as everything else about that mountain. I replied to Diane Castellano the very next morning, and her response came back within minutes, which struck me even then as strange for a woman apparently managing a family trust's affairs from somewhere in downtown Denver. She sent a contract running nearly 20 full pages, thick with clauses about liability and confidentiality, and something called the Site Protocol, a set of daily requirements that read less like ordinary caretaker duties and more like instructions for defusing something dangerous. The protocol required me to start the backup generator by no later than 7 each morning, and to inspect, and if necessary manually reset, 4 ventilation fans positioned along what the document simply called the old workings above the property. I was also required to walk a marked perimeter loop of just under 3 miles twice a day, never once crossing the orange boundary stakes painted near the collapsed mine entrance at the northern edge of the land. Every evening at exactly 6, I had to ring a cast iron bell mounted outside the lodge on a wooden frame, holding the rope for a full slow count of 30 before finally letting the old iron fall silent again. Every single reading, every observation had to be logged by hand in a bound company ledger kept inside the lodge's front office, a requirement Diane described only as an old insurance formality tied to some agreement between the mining company and the county decades earlier. When I asked why an abandoned silver mine still needed ventilation fans running nearly 120 years after it stopped producing any ore, her answer came back vague. Something about lingering methane pockets and structural stability nobody wanted to risk. She said the trust simply preferred to err on the side of caution, rather than risk any collapse that might one day damage the lodge sitting almost directly above the sealed old tunnels running beneath it. I should have pushed harder on that particular question, looking back on it now with everything I eventually learned. But $11,000 of debt has a way of making a desperate man accept the first reasonable-sounding explanation and quietly move on to the next page of the contract. I finally drove up to Argent Falls in the second week of October, the aspens already gone gold and dropping steadily along every switchback of the narrow county road climbing higher into those mountains. I met Diane in person for the very first time outside the town's only general store, a compact woman somewhere in her 50s wearing an expensive coat that seemed entirely wrong for a place where every other truck parked on the single paved street looked at least a decade old and dented. Diane drove me up to the property herself in a rented four-wheel drive. Since the final 4 miles of road climbed steep and rutted through stands of spruce and lodgepole pine before finally leveling out. It ended at a wide clearing where Solitude Lodge sat like something lifted straight from an old postcard. 2 stories of dark timber and river stone with a wraparound porch and a metal roof already dusted with that season's first thin snow. Behind the lodge, maybe 200 yards up a gentle slope, stood the mine works themselves, a cluster of weathered outbuildings surrounding a collapsed adit reinforced decades earlier with steel bracing and fresh concrete. The whole area sat fenced off with orange stakes and a line of yellow rope that looked far newer than anything else on the property, as though someone replaced it carefully every single season without fail. Diane walked me through the protocol in person that first afternoon, showing me the generator shed, the fan controls bolted to the rock near the collapsed entrance, and the bell itself hanging from a frame someone had clearly rebuilt more than once. She was oddly specific about the bell itself, telling me twice that it had to ring at exactly 6, not 5 minutes early and never 5 minutes late under any circumstance she could possibly imagine. She told me that if I ever found myself unable to ring it on time for any reason, I should note the exact minute of the delay in the ledger, along with a description of anything unusual I happened to notice that particular evening. It struck me as excessive, even for an overcautious insurance policy. But I filed the request away without much comment, eager to finish the tour before the last of the daylight disappeared behind the ridge. She left me with a stack of supplies, a working satellite phone with instructions to check in every Sunday evening without fail, and a folder of laminated pages explaining how to operate the snowcat parked inside the equipment barn. By the time her taillights finally disappeared down the switchbacks, I was alone on that mountain in a way I had not been alone in years. The silence so complete once the engine noise faded that I could hear my own pulse. I told myself that first night, lying in the narrow cabin bed and listening to the lodge settle and creak around me, that $52,000 was $52,000, regardless of how strange the contract had sounded on paper. 6 long months of pure quiet felt like exactly what I needed after a hard year that had already taken my job, my marriage, and most of my remaining savings from me in one quick and ugly little succession. The first 2 weeks up there settled into a rhythm that felt, if anything, almost peaceful. The kind of structured solitude I had not realized I was craving until I finally had it in front of me every single day. I woke before dawn to start the generator, walked the perimeter loop while the light came up gold and pink over the eastern ridgeline, and checked the 4 ventilation fans positioned at intervals along the fence line above the collapsed adit. I logged each reading in the company ledger with the same careful precision of a man who had spent 15 long years machining parts down to tolerances measured in mere thousandths of 1 single inch. I rang the bell every single evening at 6 exactly, holding the rope until my slow count of 30 finished, and the iron went still again, and I noted in the ledger, as instructed, that nothing unusual had occurred, because for those first 2 weeks nothing really had. I drove the snowcat into Argent Falls once during that stretch for supplies, and the general store owner, A heavy-set woman named Dot Sorensen, who had apparently run the place since before I was even born, filled my order without much conversation beyond the weather. She asked whether I had seen any elk moving down off the high country yet, and I noticed her expression shift slightly just for a moment. The instant I mentioned exactly where I was staying that winter, it was a flicker of something that might have been pity, or might have simply been plain surprise that anyone had taken the job again so soon after whoever came before me had already left it behind for good. I asked her what she meant by that particular look, and she waved the question off with a short laugh, telling me that Solitude Lodge went through caretakers the way some ranches went through hired hands every single season. She told me plainly that I really should not read too much into small-town gossip about a place most of the people still left living in Argent Falls had stopped thinking about years and years ago now. It was an answer that satisfied me well enough at the time, mostly because I badly wanted it to be true, and I drove back up that mountain with a truck bed full of canned goods and neatly split firewood. I did not think much more about it until the wrongness finally started. Slow at first, the kind of thing a person can explain away for weeks before the explanations simply stop holding together at all. The tracks appeared first, sometime in the third week, a set of prints pressed into the season's first real snowfall crossing the perimeter loop near the northern boundary stake in a line that troubled me the moment I saw it. They were deep and evenly spaced in a way that did not match the elk or mule deer sign I had already grown used to seeing on my morning walks around that same stretch of the boundary fence line every single day. When I crouched to study them more closely, I noticed a strange narrowness through the heel that no animal I could confidently name would have ever produced walking naturally through fresh powder like that. I photographed the prints on the satellite phone, more out of habit than any genuine alarm at that early point, and logged the observation in the ledger exactly the way the protocol required of me each morning. I described the prints as possibly canine, though even as I wrote the word down I did not fully believe it myself, since no coyote or wolf I had ever tracked before left a print quite that long relative to its width. 2 nights later I woke somewhere close to 3 in the morning to a sound coming up through the floor vents near the lodge's old stone fireplace. A low rhythmic knocking I could not place at first in my half-sleeping mind. It reminded me, absurdly, of someone tapping a single knuckle against a pipe from somewhere far below the floorboards. 3 slow taps followed by a long pause, and then 3 more in exactly the same steady pattern. The pattern felt too deliberate to be settling timber or wind moving through the old flue, and I lay awake listening to it for the better part of an hour before it finally stopped and let me drift back to sleep. I mentioned the tapping to Diane during our next scheduled call, describing it as carefully as I possibly could manage over the crackling satellite line while she listened without interrupting me once. She was quiet for a beat longer than felt entirely natural before telling me that old mine timbers sometimes shifted as the ground froze and thawed through the changing season, sending sound up through the ventilation shafts in ways that could seem almost purposeful to someone not yet used to it. That explanation technically made sense on its own terms, but it did nothing to explain why she then asked, almost as an afterthought, whether all 4 fans had been running properly that same particular evening, a question she had never once asked me before that call. She would go on to ask me that exact same question, I noticed only much later, every single time I mentioned anything at all unusual for the entire remainder of my long winter contract on that mountain. By the start of November, the small wrongness had accumulated into something I could no longer file away as mountain isolation simply playing tricks on my lonely and increasingly overtired mind that season. The thing that finally cracked my easy explanations wide open was the locked room. A door I had assumed those first few weeks led to nothing more than a linen closet or some forgotten storage space of no real interest to a busy caretaker. One evening, I noticed the deadbolt on it looked strangely new. Brushed steel set against the century-old brass hardware everywhere else in the lodge, and I stood there far longer than made any real sense for a man with a bell to ring in 20 short minutes that same evening. The protocol said nothing at all about a locked room anywhere on the property, and Diane's contract had emphasized more than once that I held full access to the entire lodge for the whole duration of my stay there. I told myself that checking behind that particular door counted less as trespassing and more as basic due diligence for a man alone on a mountain who deserved to know exactly what he was living inside of every single night. It took me most of a long Saturday afternoon working with a set of picks I still carried from a brief and fairly unglamorous stretch doing locksmith work back in my 20s, but the old bolt finally gave way beneath my patient hands. Behind it, I found a room someone had clearly used as an archive rather than a closet. Shelves of yellowed newspaper clippings, ledgers, older and far more worn than the one I logged my own daily readings in, and a corkboard covered edge to edge in photographs of men I did not recognize at all. Most of the photographs carried a date scrawled along the bottom edge in a spidery handwriting that read out years stretching back decades: 1941, 1963, 1978, 1994, each name beneath each photograph followed by a short notation. In every single case, that notation read either resigned early or contract not renewed, phrases that felt, standing there in the dust and thin cold light of that little room, far less reassuring than they had probably sounded to whoever first typed them out decades earlier. There was another incident that same week I did not write about in the ledger at all, mostly because I could not think of a clinical enough way to describe it that would not make Diane ask her usual question about the fans before I had even finished the sentence. I was splitting firewood behind the cabin a little before dusk when I heard my own name called out once from somewhere near the tree line, low and flat and strangely toneless. The kind of voice a person might use reading a word off a page rather than actually speaking to another human being. I stood there with the axe still raised, scanning the dark line of spruce for a full minute before telling myself it had been the wind moving through some gap in the rocks above the mine works that only sounded, for one bad second, like my own name spoken aloud. I did not go looking to confirm it either way, and I did not mention it to Dot Sorensen the next time I saw her down in town, since some part of me had already quietly decided that naming the fear out loud would only make it more real than it already felt standing alone in that yard. I drove into Argent Falls again near the end of that same week, mostly for fuel and a few groceries I had let run low, and I found myself asking Dot Sorensen more directly than I had before about the caretaker who worked the property just ahead of me on the rotation. She set down the can she was stocking on the shelf behind her counter and studied me for a long moment before answering, the kind of look a person gives someone they are deciding whether or not to actually trust with something true. His name was Walter Higgs, she told me finally, a quiet man from down near Durango who kept to himself in town the same way I apparently did, coming in maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks for supplies and never staying long enough for anyone to get to know him well. He finished his contract clean, she said, which I understood even then to be an unusual enough detail that she felt the need to specify it, as though most caretakers before him had not finished quite so cleanly at all. When I asked whether Walter had ever mentioned anything strange about the property, anything about sounds or tracks or a locked room upstairs in the lodge, Dot's whole expression closed off entirely right in front of me. The openness from just a moment earlier folded away behind that same careful blankness I remembered so clearly from my very first visit to her small general store back in October of that same long year. She told me she did not gossip about paying customers, current or former, and that if the trust wanted me to know more about the job than they had already told me, they would have told me themselves without needing her help. It was not an unkind answer exactly, but it carried a weight that told me she already knew far more than she was willing to say out loud to a stranger who might still be working for the people who signed her invoices every single month. I paid for my groceries and thanked her the way I always did, and I was almost out the door with the little bell above it jangling when she called out my name once, quietly, from behind the counter still. She told me only to be careful about which doors I went looking behind up there, a warning vague enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough that I thought about it the entire drive back up that mountain. I spent longer than I probably should have that same afternoon working through the older ledgers stacked on the archive room shelves, comparing handwriting and dates from one battered volume to the next as the light outside slowly began to fade toward evening. I found a pattern that unsettled me more with every single page I turned, a pattern of caretakers whose entries grew steadily shorter and more clipped in the final weeks of their contracts, no matter which decade I happened to be reading through at any given moment. Their careful daily notations about fan readings and generator hours gradually gave way to fragmented lines about sounds, about smells, and about things glimpsed at the edge of the perimeter fence once the sun had gone down each evening. Then the entries simply stopped altogether, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes with entire weeks still remaining on what should have been a full 6-month term of employment for that particular caretaker. One ledger from the late 1970s ended on a page where the handwriting had grown so tight and so cramped that it was almost barely legible even after I held it very close to the lamplight. Its final entry read, "Only they know the schedule now," followed by nothing else at all. No signature and no closing note. Just 3 blank pages before the ledger's spine gave way to a new caretaker's much neater hand starting the following spring. It read as though nothing at all unusual had happened in the months between one caretaker and the next. A silence in the paperwork that felt somehow louder than anything written on the pages around it. I sat with that particular ledger open on my lap until the light through the little window had gone from gold to gray, and when I finally checked my watch, I realized I had less than 10 minutes left to reach the bell before 6. I ran the whole way down the stairs and clear across the frozen front yard with a fear in my chest. I could not fully explain to myself, even as my own boots kept right on sliding on the icy ground beneath me. I arrived at the bell frame with barely a minute to spare, ringing it with hands that would not quite stop shaking through the full count of 30. The protocol demanded of every caretaker who had ever stood in that exact spot before me. I did not sleep well at all that night, replaying the ledger's broken fragments over and over again in my tired head until the gray light of morning finally seeped through the cabin's small frosted window. I woke determined to find real answers rather than continue guessing at whatever history the trust had gone to such careful trouble to keep entirely out of the contract I had originally signed back in October. I loaded the snowcat with enough fuel for the long round trip and drove the 2 hours down toward Auray, the nearest town large enough to still have a proper historical society with any real archive worth searching through. The drive down to Auray took longer than the mileage alone suggested it should, the county road switching back on itself again and again through stands of aspen and spruce before finally dropping into the canyon. The town itself sat wedged between sheer rock walls that blocked out a good portion of the midday sun, even on an otherwise perfectly clear winter afternoon, and I had not been back to anything resembling a real town since my first supply run to Argent Falls back in October. The ordinary sight of a coffee shop and a hardware store and a handful of tourists in bright jackets left me feeling strangely disconnected from my own life, as though I had been dropped into a world that kept moving normally while mine had narrowed to just a bell. The Historical Society occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian building 2 blocks off the main street, its windows crowded with old mining photographs and a hand-lettered sign advertising summer walking tours. I sat in my truck outside for a full 5 minutes before going in, running through what I actually planned to say to a stranger about ledgers and locked rooms and tracks in the snow that did not match any animal I could name. In the end, I settled on telling Helen Marsh only that I was researching the general history of a property I currently worked, which was true enough not to feel like an outright lie right to her own face. I was hoping someone there might know something concrete about the Ansel Whitcomb Silver Company, a name I had found stamped into the spine of every single one of those old ledgers upstairs at the lodge. The archivist, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s named Helen Marsh, who had apparently spent most of her long career cataloging mining records for half the abandoned claims scattered across the San Juans, recognized the company name almost immediately. She pulled a thin folder of yellowed newspaper clippings from a filing cabinet without needing to check any index first, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had handled that particular folder more than once before. She told me the Ansel Whitcomb operation had once been among the larger silver producers in the entire region, right up until a catastrophic collapse in the tunnels beneath what the company then called the Faithful Widow claim. That collapse killed somewhere between 31 and 37 men, depending entirely on which contemporary newspaper account a person chose to believe. During the hard winter of 1907, the official cause listed in every surviving document was a structural failure triggered by unusually heavy snowmelt the previous spring, a straightforward explanation that satisfied the county inspectors at the time without much apparent difficulty. Helen mentioned, almost as an aside, while she sorted carefully through the rest of the folder, that several surviving miners interviewed by a Denver newspaper reporter in the weeks after the disaster had given accounts that never made it into the paper's final printed version at all. Those accounts describe sounds coming from deeper in the collapsed tunnels for days afterward, tapping in low voices that rescue crews initially mistook for trapped survivors still clinging to life somewhere beneath the mountain. The company called off the recovery effort entirely less than 3 weeks after the collapse and sealed the main shaft with concrete. An unusually fast decision for an operation that still, on paper at least, considered dozens of its own employees potentially alive down there. Helen also found, tucked into the back of that same folder, a photocopy of a company memo dated several months after the sealing, written by a physician the company had retained named Dr. Aldous Pruitt. It was addressed to the Ansel Whitcomb Board of Directors and marked, even in photocopy, with a stamp reading confidential in faded red ink that had bled slightly into the surrounding paper over the decades. The memo was strange enough that Helen read part of it aloud to me herself, since she said she had never quite known what to make of it in all her years handling that particular collection of records. It described what Pruitt called a persistent phenomenon originating from the sealed workings, one he believed the company would be wiser to manage through controlled ventilation and a fixed schedule of what he termed acknowledgement, rather than through further attempts at any permanent sealing. His own notes suggested the company had already tried permanent sealing twice more in the years immediately following the original collapse, both times resulting in what the memo described only as regrettable incidents at the surface structures built above the old shaft. I asked Helen if she had any real idea what the memo meant by that particular word acknowledgement, and she admitted honestly that she did not, though she pointed out something else worth considering carefully. According to county tax records she had cross-referenced years earlier for an unrelated project, the company kept a full-time employee at the Faithful Widow property continuously since the collapse, through several changes in ownership and even after silver mining in the district effectively ended. That continuity of staffing made no real economic sense for a played-out claim, she said, unless the company genuinely believed, as Pruitt's memo strongly suggested, that something about the site required constant and deliberate attention rather than simple, quiet abandonment. I drove back up the mountain that evening with the photocopied memo folded carefully in my jacket pocket beside the hospital bill I still had not managed to pay off, arriving at the lodge with barely enough daylight left to walk the perimeter loop before full dark set in around me. As I approached the northern boundary stake near the collapsed dead, I noticed the narrow tracks from 3 weeks earlier had reappeared, fresher now, crossing the orange marker rope in a line leading straight toward the lodge, rather than away from it the way that earlier set had gone. I rang the bell that evening with Pruitt's memo still folded in my pocket, holding the rope through the full count of 30 with a new and very specific dread settling deep into my chest as the iron swung back and forth above me. I understood for the first time that the ritual I had been performing twice daily, without much real thought, was not, as Diane had implied months earlier, some outdated insurance formality left over from an overcautious old mining company. It was something closer to what Pruitt himself had called it in his own careful handwriting, an acknowledgement, a daily proof of presence offered to whatever still occupied the sealed tunnels beneath my own cabin floor each and every single night. I found myself wondering, standing alone in the gathering dark with the bell's last echo still fading slowly off the ridgeline above me. What exactly happened to a caretaker who simply forgot to ring it on time even once? I asked Helen Marsh before I left her archive that day in RA whether any record existed of what eventually happened to Dr. Pruitt himself once his years of studying the presence beneath the Faithful Widow claim had finally run their course. She pulled one more folder from a different drawer, thinner than the others, and told me the county coroner's records showed he had died quietly in his own bed in 1952 at the age of 81. It was an ordinary enough death by every medical account available, plain heart failure in his sleep, no violence of any kind ever noted anywhere at all in that particular county coroner's own case file. What struck her, she said, flipping through the folder with the same careful patience she had shown me all afternoon, was a small handwritten note the attending physician had added, almost as an afterthought, at the bottom of the death certificate itself. It stated only that the deceased had been found with both hands pressed flat against his own chest, fingers spread wide in a position the physician described as unusual enough to mention, though not unusual enough, apparently, to investigate any further than that single passing observation. Helen said she had always assumed it meant nothing at all, an old man's tired hands simply settling where they happened to settle during his final quiet hours alone in that house. Nothing more than that. Standing in her archive with Pruitt's own memo still in my hand, I found myself thinking instead about a company physician who had spent decades listening for a bell only he ever fully understood the meaning of. I wondered whether some habits, once learned deeply enough, simply never stop finding a way to keep their own quiet rhythm going, long after the original reason for keeping them has technically ended. I did not have to wonder for very long, because the storm that rolled in during the second week of November answered that exact question for me far more thoroughly than I ever really wanted it answered. The forecast on the satellite phone that morning had called for 6 to 8 inches, manageable enough by the standards I had already grown used to on that particular mountain over the past several weeks. The system stalled directly over the sandlions instead of moving through the way the forecast predicted, and by early afternoon the snow was falling so fast and thick that I lost sight of the mineworks entirely from the lodge's front porch railing. It was a whiteout so complete that it felt far less like ordinary weather than like the mountain itself had slowly decided to close its own cold fist around the entire snowbound property that whole afternoon. The generator itself failed a little after 4 that afternoon, choking out with a cough and a stutter that told me immediately the fuel line had frozen somewhere along its run out to the equipment shed. It was a problem I had already handled twice before, without much real trouble, except that this time, without the generator running, the 4 ventilation fans along the fence line above the adit stopped running as well. Within perhaps 20 minutes of that sudden silence, I began to hear the tapping start again, only now it was not coming faintly through the floor vents the way it had those first few times weeks before. It was coming from everywhere at once inside that lodge, low and rhythmic and unmistakably deliberate, rising up through the walls and the floorboards of the entire building as though the whole structure had somehow become a drum. I bundled into every layer of cold weather gear I owned and forced myself out into the whiteout toward the generator shed, following a length of rope I had tied months earlier between the porch rail and the shed door for exactly this kind of emergency situation. The wind out there carried something beneath its own roar that I could not make myself believe was only weather, a low chorus of sound that rose and fell in a pattern too close to breathing for my comfort that night. It was close enough that I found myself checking back over my own shoulder every few steps, despite seeing nothing at all beyond 3 feet of driving snow in every direction around me that whole time. The fuel line problem turned out to be worse than the usual frozen condensation, a full blockage that took me nearly 40 minutes of work with cold numbed fingers and a small hand torch to finally clear completely. During those 40 minutes, the tapping sound from the direction of the mine works grew steadily louder, joined eventually by something that was not tapping at all, but closer to scraping, metal against solid rock. It was slow and patient, coming as far as I could tell through the storm from directly behind the orange boundary stakes I had been instructed for 6 straight weeks, never once to cross under any circumstance. For one instant during those 40 minutes at the generator's shed, a gap opened in the driving snow just long enough for me to see something pale moving low along the fence line near the northern boundary stake, closer to the lodge than the scraping sound had any right to be that evening. It was not upright and it was not on all fours either, moving instead in some low, jointed way that reminded me uncomfortably of a hand walking on its fingertips across a tabletop. If a hand could somehow be the size of a grown man crossing open ground. The gap in the snow closed again almost as quickly as it had opened, and I told myself afterward, lying awake long after the generator finally caught and held, that the storm and the cold in 6 straight weeks of creeping dread had simply shown me something that was not actually there at all. I wanted very badly to believe that explanation, and for the better part of the next several days I mostly managed to, right up until I found the gouges in the frozen ground the following morning, and understood I had not imagined a single part of it. I got the generator restarted a little after 5 that evening, watching with a relief I can still feel in my chest even now as the fan controls flickered back to life on their panel near the sealed deed above the property. The scraping sound stopped almost immediately, cutting off with an abruptness that felt far more like intention than simple coincidence, leaving only the wind and my own ragged breathing in the sudden and complete quiet that followed. I made it back to the lodge with perhaps 11 minutes left before 6, and I rang that bell with hands so cold and shaking that I nearly lost my grip on the rope twice while the storm screamed all around me. Every instinct I had told me to run for the cabin door instead, but I held through the full count of 30 anyway, refusing to let go before the ritual was properly finished, no matter how badly my body wanted otherwise. When the last echo of iron finally faded into the wind, the mountain went, for one long and unbearable moment, completely and totally silent. No wind, no tapping, no scraping. Nothing at all left standing. Then the storm simply resumed itself again, as though it had never once paused for me at all. The snow and the wind roaring back in exactly where they had left off only a few seconds before that moment. I logged that entry in the ledger with a hand I could barely make legible, describing the generator failure and the fan outage and the sounds I had heard in language as clinical as I could possibly manage under the circumstances. I noted at the very bottom of the page the exact number of minutes the fans had been offline that evening. 17. A detail that felt strangely important even though I could not have said exactly why at the time. 2 days later, once the storm had cleared enough for the satellite connection to hold steady again, Diane called and asked me, in a voice with an edge to it I had never once heard from her before, to confirm that specific number a second time. The days that followed the storm carried a different quality of fear than anything I had felt before it. A fear grounded now in physical evidence, rather than half-glimpsed tracks and half-heard sounds in the dark. I found myself walking the perimeter loop each morning, studying the ground near the boundary stakes for signs of whatever exactly had been scraping at the rock during those 17 minutes the fan stood completely silent. I found fresh gouges cut into the frozen earth just inside the orange marker line. 4 or 5 parallel grooves, each roughly the width of a finger, but far too deep and too evenly spaced to have come from any tool or animal claw I recognized. I brought my findings to Diane during our next scheduled call and told her plainly that I needed real answers now rather than another big reference to old timbers and lingering methane pockets in the rock. After a long pause on the crackling line, she finally admitted, in a clipped tone that suggested she had rehearsed the disclosure before for other caretakers, that the trust knew the property carried what she called an unusual liability tied to the 1907 collapse. She said the daily protocol existed specifically to manage that liability rather than to prevent any conventional structural failure of the kind listed so plainly in my original signed contract paperwork. She would not elaborate much further beyond confirming that every single caretaker before me had received that exact same explanation once the circumstances eventually forced her own hand to finally do so. She reminded me, with what felt like genuine unease rather than simple corporate caution, that my contract still had 4.5 months remaining, and that leaving early would forfeit not only my second payment, but also any protections the completed protocol was meant to provide me that season. I drove into Argent Falls once more that same week, mostly to buy a box of rifle shells and a length of heavy chain I intended to run through the porch door handles each night after dark, a precaution that felt almost embarrassing to explain to myself even as I loaded it into the truck bed. Sorensen rang up the purchase without comment, though she added a box of road flares to the counter unprompted and told me they were on the house this time. A small kindness that meant more to me standing there than the actual dollar value of the gesture ever could have. I paid $118 for everything altogether, counting out the bills slowly while she watched me with an expression I could not fully read. Something between pity and grudging respect for a man who had apparently decided to stay on anyway. She told me, as I carried the last bag out to the truck, that Walter Higgs had bought the exact same length of chain from her the winter before, in the exact same week of that season, and that she had wondered even then whether she should have said more to him before he drove back up that same road. I asked her directly what she thought I should do differently than Walter apparently had, and she was quiet for a long moment before telling me only to keep ringing that bell no matter what. Every single evening, no matter how tired or scared it made me feel standing out there. Diane herself drove up the mountain 3 days after that call about the gouges, arriving in a different rented 4-wheel drive loaded down with extra fuel canisters and a case of supplies the trust apparently wanted delivered to me in person this time. She looked older than she had back in October, the expensive coat replaced now by a practical parka that still somehow managed to look entirely wrong for that particular mountain we both stood on that afternoon. She walked the entire perimeter loop with me that whole cold afternoon, without once mentioning the ledger entries or the fan readings the way she normally always did each week over the crackling phone. Near the northern boundary stake, she finally stopped and stood quietly for a while, studying the fresh gouges I had already photographed and reported to her office days before that particular visit up there. I watched something pass slowly across her face that looked, for the very first time since I had ever known her at all, less like ordinary corporate caution and more like plain human guilt about it all. I asked her outright, standing there in the cold with the wind picking up steadily around the both of us, how long she herself had actually known what the fans and the bell truly protected against on that whole property. She was quiet long enough that I genuinely thought she might not answer me at all, before finally admitting she had taken this exact job 11 years earlier under circumstances not entirely unlike my own. It had been a family emergency, and a mountain of debt and a listing that had seemed, at the time, like the answer to a prayer, though she told me she had never once been a caretaker herself out on that mountain, only ever the one who hired them each season on the trust's behalf. The guilt of it had worn a slow groove into her over the years, one she suspected never fully closed for anyone who understood the arrangement and still chose to keep participating in it anyway, herself included. Before she finally left that evening, she pressed an envelope into my hand containing an extra $2,000 in cash. Money she said was not on any invoice and would never appear on any tax document the trust filed with the state. She told me to consider it hazard pay, from one person who understood exactly what the job truly cost to another who was still out there paying that same cost in real time, entirely alone up on that mountain. I nearly left that same week anyway, sitting up one night with my bag half packed and the snowcat fueled and ready in the equipment barn, doing the math again on the debt and the mortgage still due on a house I no longer lived in with anyone. I understood, with a bitterness I still carry with me even now, that $52,000 represented the difference between finally climbing out of the hole Rachel and I had dug together and sinking permanently into it completely alone instead. Whatever waited beneath that mountain, I'd already survived one full storm against it, and could likely survive 4.5 more months if I simply refused to let the fans or the bell ever fail again on my watch. I unpacked that bag before dawn, ashamed of how close I had actually come to running away from a job I had promised to finish, and I recommitted myself to the protocol with a rigor that bordered on total obsession from that morning forward. I checked the generator's fuel lines twice daily instead of only once, insulating the whole run out to the shed with foam sleeves I fashioned myself from spare pipe wrap left over in the equipment barn. I set 3 separate alarms on the satellite phone every single afternoon to make absolutely certain I never again came within even a single minute of missing that 6 o'clock evening bell ritual again. It was during this period of grim, careful routine that I finally found the thing that explained everything. Tucked inside a false panel at the back of the archive room's bottom shelf against the wall. I only discovered it because one of the old ledgers I had returned to its place sat slightly crooked, and when I reached to straighten it, my fingers caught the edge of a seam in the wood that did not belong there at all. Behind that panel, I found a single leather-bound journal far older than anything else in the room, its cover cracked and gone soft with age from decades of handling by whoever had hidden it there originally. Inside, in handwriting I matched after some careful study to the signature on Dr. Aldous Pruitt's original 1907 memo, was a detailed and increasingly desperate account of the years he had spent quietly studying what he referred to throughout only as the presence. He never once used any more specific name for it, as though naming the thing more precisely carried its own particular kind of risk. He was unwilling to take even in a private journal meant for no other eyes but his own. Pruitt's account, once I worked through his cramped and often water-damaged handwriting over the following several evenings, laid out a history far stranger and darker than the bare facts Helen Marsh had already shown me back in Ouray. It described how the 30-odd miners trapped by the 1907 collapse had, according to sounds the recovery crews documented before the effort was fully abandoned, remained alive and audible for at least 11 full days after the tunnels sealed shut behind them. They tapped coded messages against the rock that 2 of the surviving crew members, both former telegraph operators by trade, had translated well enough to understand the trapped men were slowly and horribly changing into something else entirely. Pruitt's notes described this transformation only in fragments, mentioning a sensitivity to light, a sensitivity to silence, and a growing pull toward sound and vibration and warmth in ways that stopped resembling ordinary human survival instinct. It began, in Pruitt's own unsettling phrase, to resemble a colony slowly reorganizing itself around a single shared and endlessly patient hunger that had not existed in any one of those men before that collapse. The company's decision to abandon the rescue and seal the shaft permanently had come only after 2 separate recovery teams sent in through a secondary adit failed to return at all from those tunnels. Pruitt's journal made painfully clear that the company understood, even then, that whatever now occupied those tunnels was no longer simply a group of trapped and slowly dying men underground somewhere. It had become something that assembled itself, slowly and with terrible patience, out of their remaining raw material into a single distributed presence able to sense vibration through solid rock itself. Pruitt estimated its full effective range, based on incidents documented over the following several decades, at no less than half a mile in every given direction from the original collapse site itself. The two later sealing attempts Pruitt referenced in his original memo had each ended, his journal explained in grim and unflinching detail, with surface structures built above the mine suffering what he called only regrettable incidents in his own careful company language. In the first instance, that phrase in the fuller accounts meant the deaths of 4 company employees stationed at a surface pump house sometime in 1911, found by a relief crew in a state Pruitt refused to describe any further than that. In the second instance, it meant the complete disappearance without any trace at all of an entire family who had briefly attempted to homestead that same property sometime back in the 1920s. That family had been entirely unaware of what actually lay beneath the very ground they had so hopefully chosen to build their small cabin upon that particular spring, decades before I ever arrived, myself. Pruitt's eventual conclusion, arrived at only after those 2 disasters and reluctantly accepted by a company board more concerned with liability than genuine understanding, was that the presence beneath the mountain could not simply be starved into dormancy through silence and permanent sealing. Silence and total isolation seemed only to make it more desperate and correspondingly far more dangerous to anything and anyone still living or working nearby it on that particular stretch of mountain. One passage near the middle of the journal stayed with me more than any other, written in a steadier hand than the shaking entries near the end, and I copied it out onto a loose page of my own, so I would not have to keep reopening the fragile old book itself each time I wanted to reread it. It is not intelligence in the way we mean the word among ourselves, Pruitt had written, but it learns and it remembers, and it appears to want nothing more complicated in the end than to be acknowledged by whoever stands watch above it on any given evening. I have come to believe, he continued, that the bell means less as a sound than as proof someone still remembers what is owed, a debt the company earned the day it chose concrete over listening further to men who were, whatever else they had become, still calling out from the dark below. I read that particular passage 3 or 4 separate times over the following weeks, usually late at night with the lamp turned down low, and each time it left me with that exact same uneasy question. I never managed to answer it for myself before my own contract finally ended, whether ringing that bell each evening made me a true caretaker, or only the latest man paying down a debt none of us had ever actually agreed to owe in the first place. Pruitt's notes made clear the presence could instead be managed indefinitely through a controlled routine of ventilation, which it seemed to interpret as a kind of breathing space it was willing to accept in place of true freedom from those sealed tunnels below. That routine was combined with a fixed, reliable daily signal of vibration sent down through the bell, which Pruitt's notes suggested the presence had slowly come to recognize as proof its confinement remained deliberate and attended, rather than accidental and quietly abandoned. It was a distinction that seemed to matter to it in ways Pruitt himself admitted he could not fully explain, even after decades spent carefully studying the pattern from a cautious and respectful distance up on the surface. The final pages of Pruitt's journal, written in a hand grown shaky with what I assumed at first was simply old age catching up with him, contained his last and most troubling observation of all in the entire account. It explained why the company had settled on a rotation of caretakers rather than assigning one single person permanently to the role for the remainder of their entire working life on that whole mountain. Pruitt had originally recommended the rotation himself out of simple humanitarian concern for the psychological toll the isolated work clearly took on any one man left alone up there too long each time. Then he began noticing a pattern he carefully documented across several consecutive caretakers through the 1930s and into the 1940s. One that troubled him more than anything he had written before it. The presence beneath the mountain appeared to grow steadily more attuned to any single caretaker's specific rhythm and daily presence the longer that person remained alone on site without any real relief from another living soul. It grew correspondingly more capable of anticipating exactly when the bell would ring and exactly when the fans would run each and every single day of that particular caretaker's long winter contract there. It also grew more willing, Pruitt wrote, to test the boundaries of the whole arrangement in the weeks following any extended stretch of that familiarity between the mountain and the man watching over it. That testing took the form, in at least 3 documented cases before the company finally instituted a hard 6-month rotation limit, of increasingly bold incursions past the boundary markers during a caretaker's final weeks on site. In every one of those 3 cases, the incursions ended with the caretaker resigning abruptly with no explanation. Or, in one case, Pruitt described only in a terse and heavily crossed-out line, not resigning at all. During one of my perimeter walks in early March, taking a slightly wider loop than usual, after a fresh snowfall had softened the ground enough to make walking easier off the pack's trail, I found a small weathered marker half buried near a stand of dead aspens well outside the fenced boundary line. It was not a proper headstone, just a flat piece of slate. Someone had scratched a single set of initials into decades earlier. The letters worn nearly smooth by weather but still legible enough to trace with a bare finger. There was no name beneath those initials and no date carved anywhere on the stone. Nothing to identify who exactly rested there, only the letters themselves and the deliberate care someone had taken hiding that marker where a caretaker on the standard loop would never think to look. I thought immediately of Pruitt's crossed-out line about the one caretaker who had not resigned at all, and I stood over that slate marker for a long time in the bitter cold, wondering how many other unmarked places like it might be scattered across those several thousand acres of company land. I did not dig, and I did not disturb the ground around it any further than my own boots already had crossing that stretch of fresh snow, choosing instead to photograph the stone carefully before covering it back over exactly as I had first found it that morning. I finished the rest of my perimeter loop that particular morning in a silence that had nothing at all to do with the thin mountain air around me, or the cold, or the wind picking up hard along that ridge. I closed the journal that night with my hand still not quite steady, finally understanding why every single ledger in that archive room ended the exact same way it always did, page after page after page. I understood why Diane had always asked, almost reflexively, whether the fans had been running properly every single time I mentioned anything even slightly unusual during our long weekly calls together. I understood, with a dread that settled deep into my chest and did not fully leave for the remainder of my contract, that I had roughly 10 weeks left before reaching the point in the rotation where Pruitt's documented pattern of increasingly bold incursions had historically begun to appear. 10 weeks during which I would need to maintain perfect, unbroken discipline with the bell and the fans if I hoped to reach April with my contract, my sanity, and my own life all still fully intact and unbroken. Those 10 weeks passed in a blur of grim, exhausting vigilance that I do not fully remember now in individual detail, so much as in a general impression of cold and fear and relentless daily routine that never let up. Certain nights still stand out clearly enough even now. The night in early December when the fans on the second panel began cycling on and off entirely on their own, despite no fault I could ever locate anywhere in the wiring. There was the night in January when I woke to find the orange boundary rope near the northern stake cut clean through in 3 separate places. The cuts far too smooth and deliberate to have come from ordinary weather or wildlife of any kind. There was the long and terrible week in early February when a second storm system stalled over the property for 4 straight days, forcing me to sleep in short shifts of no more than 2 hours at a time. I never once let myself fully rest, so that I would never once fail to hear the fuel line alarm I had rigged from an old smoke detector and a long length of wire run all the way out to the generator shed. I made every single bell ring during those grinding 10 weeks, every one, holding the rope through the full count of 30 even on the night in late February when my hands were bleeding badly from a fall on the ice. Every part of me wanted nothing more than to collapse inside the cabin and let that 6 o'clock deadline pass just once. But by then I understood something no contract clause or company memo could have ever taught me. I understood exactly what waited so patiently down there on the other side of a missed evening ring, and I was simply not willing to find that particular thing out for myself firsthand. Not ever again. The worst of those certain nights came in late January, 3 weeks before the incident with the boundary rope, when something struck the front door of the lodge hard enough that I felt the impact through the floorboards under my bare feet before I ever heard the sound of it land. I grabbed the rifle I kept propped by the fireplace, more out of instinct than any real belief it would do much good against whatever was out there, and I stood in the dark front room listening to a slow, deliberate scraping move along the porch boards from one end to the other and back again. It paused directly outside the door for what felt like a full minute, long enough that I could hear something that might have been breathing, if breathing could sound that wet and that uneven, coming through the old wood only inches from where I stood, frozen with the rifle raised. I did not open that door and did not look through the window beside it, choosing instead to back slowly toward the stairs while keeping the barrel pointed at the entrance, my finger resting light against the guard the way my father taught me hunting elk outside Pueblo. Whatever it was eventually moved off the porch and down into the yard, its retreating steps growing fainter and less deliberate the farther they traveled from the lodge, until the ordinary sounds of wind and settling snow finally swallowed them completely sometime before dawn arrived. I found a single boot print in the snow the next morning near the bottom porch step, half again too large to belong to any man, and pointed, strangely, back toward the house rather than away from it, as though whatever left it had been walking backward the entire time it approached that door. Diane called on the final Sunday of my contract, the third week of April, to confirm the arrangements for closing out the property before that long winter season officially ended for good that particular year. A snowcat and a small crew were coming up the following Wednesday to help me pack out and begin the handoff process for whichever caretaker the trust had already lined up to replace me on that mountain. She mentioned that particular detail so casually, as though it were the single most unremarkable thing in the entire world, that it took me a long moment to fully register exactly what she had just said to me. The replacement was already hired, already briefed, already scheduled to arrive at Solitude Lodge less than a week after I finally left it behind for good, as though the position I had spent 6 brutal months surviving was simply a seat that could never sit empty for even a single day. I asked her, more sharply than I probably should have given how much I still wanted that final payment to clear without any complication, whether the new caretaker truly understood what they were actually agreeing to. Diane's answer came back careful and practiced in a way that told me she had given some version of it many times before to many previous caretakers standing exactly where I now stood on that same porch. Every caretaker received precisely the information they needed at precisely the moment they were ready to receive it, she said. An answer that told me everything about how the trust had managed to keep this whole arrangement running for well over a century. Not a single word of it had ever reached a newspaper, a courtroom, or anyone at all outside the small close circle of people who quietly profited from the silence surrounding that whole mountain range. The crew arrived that Wednesday morning exactly as promised, and I spent the whole day walking a stranger from the trust's maintenance staff through the generator shed, the fan panels, and the old bell frame one final time. I described the protocol in the same flat, careful language Diane had used with me 8 long months earlier, watching his eyes glaze slightly at what he clearly assumed was standard overcautious property management rather than anything genuinely worth taking seriously. I found myself wanting, more than once that entire afternoon, to grab him by the jacket and tell him absolutely everything I knew, the tracks, the tapping, the scraping I had heard during that storm. Pruitt's journal still hidden in my duffel bag beneath a change of clothes. Every single time the words rose in my throat, I thought of the $52,000 still owed to me, half of it already spent clearing the hospital bill and the last of the divorce lawyer's invoices from the year before. I said nothing beyond what the official handoff required of me, telling myself that a full-grown man reading a contract with his eyes wide open deserved the same chance to make his own choices that I had once made with mine. I left that mountain the following morning with the second half of my payment already confirmed sitting in my bank account, and Pruitt's old journal zipped carefully away into the bottom of my duffel bag. I drove down through RA and then east toward Pueblo with the windows cracked despite the biting cold, needing the sound of moving air to fill a silence that felt, after 6 full months on that mountain, almost unbearably loud in its own right. I told myself, somewhere around Gunnison, that I was finished with Solitude Lodge for good, that I would deposit the money, pay off what remained of my debts, and never think about the San Juans again if I could possibly help it. For a while, through that summer, and on into the following fall, that plan mostly held together, though I noticed I had developed a habit I could not quite shake of checking the time compulsively as 6 o'clock approached each and every evening. It was a small, persistent unease that never fully resolved itself, no matter how many long months slowly passed or how very far I physically moved away from that particular ridgeline above Argent Falls. Beth noticed the change in me before I ever admitted it to her directly, calling most Sundays that summer to ask careful, roundabout questions about how the mountain had actually gone that whole winter I spent up there. I answered her mostly with half-truths about the cold weather and the long hours, and a difficult but ultimately harmless employer who paid very well indeed for my continued silence about all of it that year. I told her the money had cleared the hospital bill and the last of the lawyer's fees, which was true, and that I felt more like myself again than I had in years, which was not quite true, but close enough that I could say it without my voice giving anything away over the phone. She asked once, toward the end of August, why I still flinched a little whenever her kitchen clock chimed the hour, a habit she had noticed during a weekend visit and mentioned only once before letting it drop entirely. I told her it was just an old habit from working alone up there, timing things out of boredom more than necessity, and she accepted that answer, the way she had accepted most of my answers since the divorce, gently and without much real conviction behind her own nodding. Then, in the second week of the following October, almost exactly 1 year after that first email had landed in my inbox at the machine shop break room, Diane Castellano called my cell phone directly for the first time since my contract had ended the previous spring. Her voice sounded tight in a way that told me, before she had even said one single word to me, that something terrible up there had gone badly wrong on that same mountain once again. Somehow, already. She asked without much preamble whether I would consider returning to Solitude Lodge on an emergency basis, since the caretaker who replaced me had stopped responding to check-in calls 3 full days earlier that week. The fans on the second panel had gone completely dark, according to the property's remote monitoring system, and the bell, according to the last working camera feed the trust still maintained near the porch, had not rung at 6 o'clock for 2 consecutive evenings running. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear for a long moment, looking out my apartment window at a gray Pueblo afternoon that felt 1,000 miles removed from that mountain and everything hidden beneath it. I found myself doing the math on debts I no longer owed and a life I had only just begun quietly rebuilding for myself. And somewhere underneath all of that careful arithmetic, I felt the old cold certainty settle back into my chest. I understood that whatever still waited in that sealed mountain now knew my particular rhythm better than anyone else alive, and that some part of me had known, from the moment I first drove away the previous April, that the mountain was never really finished with me at all. I told Diane I needed until morning to decide, and she agreed, though the strain in her voice made clear she did not really think morning would change much of anything about the situation up there at all. I did not sleep that night either, sitting instead at my kitchen table with Pruitt's journal open in front of me to the passage about acknowledgement, reading it again by the light of a single lamp the way I had so many times that long winter on the mountain. I thought about Walter Higgs, whose contract had ended clean according to Dot Sorensen, and about the caretaker after him, whose fans had gone dark and whose bell had gone silent for 2 evenings running while I sat safe in an apartment 180 miles away. I thought about the slate marker under the dead aspens, and about the $2,000 in cash still folded inside an envelope in my dresser drawer. Money I had never quite been able to spend on anything as ordinary as groceries or rent. By the time the sun came up over the valley outside my window, I had already packed a bag I told myself was only for driving up to briefly assess things, though some part of me that had spent 6 months ringing a bell each evening already understood there was very little left to assess. I called Diane back a little after 7 that morning and told her I would drive up, though I made her promise the trust would cover a second caretaker to work alongside me for at least the first week. I wanted someone with real hands and a strong back this time around, in case whatever waited up there required far more than just a bell and a set of working fans to properly manage this time, all alone. She agreed almost too quickly, the relief plane even through the satellite delay, and told me a man named Curtis Reyna from the trust maintenance crew would meet me at the Argent Falls turnoff by early afternoon. He would bring a snowcat and enough supplies for a full week with him, in case the storm forecast for later that same night made the final approach up the mountain difficult for either of us that day. I spent the drive west out of Pueblo, running through everything I still remembered from Pruitt's journal, the bell, the fans, the acknowledgement, turning each detail over in my mind the way I once turned machine parts under a lathe. I checked every single dimension against the tolerance I had learned the hard way not to ever trust to memory alone anymore. Not after everything that particular mountain had already taught me the hard way. Somewhere past Salida, the radio lost its last clear station, and I drove the rest of the way in a silence broken only by the tire chains humming against pavement and, once, the sound of my own voice saying Curtis's name aloud just to hear something other than my own thoughts filling that cab. Curtis turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s who had worked construction crews across 3 different states before finally landing with the trust some 2 years earlier that spring. He talked easily the whole drive up from the turnoff about nothing in particular, weather and gas prices and a daughter starting college that fall, apparently unaware of anything unusual about the property waiting for us. I let him talk, grateful for the noise filling the cab of the snowcat, and I did not correct him when he joked that the previous caretaker had probably just gotten spooked by the isolation up there alone. He figured the man had simply walked off toward town rather than freeze slowly to death out there, all alone filing one more useless report that nobody would ever actually bother reading through anyway. We reached the lodge a little before 4 o'clock that particular cold afternoon, the light already slanting low in gold across the whole clearing the way it always seemed to that time of year up there. I felt something tighten hard in my chest at the very first sight of that porch, the bell frame still standing exactly where I had left it 11 long months earlier, silent now and rimed thick with frost. The caretaker's own truck sat parked at an angle near the equipment barn, driver's door still hanging wide open, and there were no footprints at all leading away from it anywhere in that fresh deep snow. There was only a single set of tracks circling the vehicle twice before ending abruptly at the porch steps, as though whoever made them had simply stopped partway through their own third slow loop around it. Curtis noticed the tracks a half-second after I did, and whatever easy conversation had carried us up the mountain died completely in his throat, replaced by a wariness I recognized immediately from my own first weeks on that property the previous October. We checked the generator shed first, both of us moving quickly without needing to discuss it much between us, and found the fuel lines intact but the unit itself switched off manually right at the panel. That single small detail alone told me more than almost anything else in that whole shed could have. That whatever happened here had not been an accident of weather or simple equipment failure at all. The 4 fan controls near the sealed ditch showed that exact same story, each switch thrown deliberately to the off position rather than tripped by any storm or power surge of any kind at all that night. I stood there in that fading light with Curtis right there beside me, trying hard to explain things in the most careful language that would not immediately convince him I had lost my own mind entirely. He listened without much visible reaction, the way a man listens when he has already decided to keep working regardless of what he is being told, and he simply asked what needed doing first, to get things running again before dark fully settled over the property. We restored power within 20 minutes, the generator catching on the second pole the way it always had for me, and I watched the fan panel lights flicker back to green one by one with a relief that nearly buckled my knees right there in the snow. I checked my watch and saw we had 11 minutes until 6, and without fully explaining why, I told Curtis I needed to ring the bell immediately and that he should stay well back from the frame until I finish. He did not argue, only stepped aside and watched with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and the beginning of real understanding. The kind that comes when a person's easy explanations for a strange situation stop fitting the actual shape of what is standing in front of them. I gripped that cold rope with hands that remembered the motion far better than my own conscious mind did, counting through the full slow 30 the way I had done hundreds of times the previous winter. When the last note faded off the ridgeline, the whole mountain went quiet in that same unbearable way I remembered. No wind, no settling snow, nothing at all, before the ordinary sounds of evening slowly returned around us both. I had kept a written schedule taped inside the cabin door that whole first winter, a simple grid of hours filled in by hand each morning, generator by 7, perimeter by 8, fan checks by 9, the bell circled in red at the bottom. It was a habit left over from the machine shop floor, where a missed step in a sequence could ruin an entire batch of parts and cost real money, and I found some strange comfort applying that same rigid discipline to a job that had nothing to do with metal or tolerances at all anymore. Curtis noticed that same taped schedule still hanging there the moment he first walked into the cabin, running one thick finger down the column of red circles without saying a word. and I could tell from his face that he already understood what kind of man he was about to work beside. Curtis found the missing caretaker an hour later, not inside the lodge where we had both expected to look first, but in the old archive room upstairs behind that same false panel I had discovered in my own first winter on the property. The man was alive, curled tight against the far wall with both knees drawn up to his chest, and Pruitt's original 1907 memo still clutched tight in one shaking, half-frostbitten hand of his. He would not speak one single coherent word to either of us that whole night beyond one phrase repeated over and over in a flat, toneless voice. "They know the schedule now. They know the schedule now. They know the schedule now." We wrapped him in every blanket the lodge still had left and radioed for a medical evacuation that could not reach us until the following morning, given the rough terrain and the failing light outside. I sat with him through those long hours while Curtis kept the fans running and rang the bell himself the very next evening under my careful instruction, learning that whole rhythm out of sheer necessity. I understood, watching Curtis hold that rope with the same white-knuckled grip I remembered from my own first months, that the rotation Pruitt described in his journal had already quietly begun again. One caretaker's watch simply ended so another's could immediately start up, the mountain itself entirely indifferent to which particular man stood there, at that bell, just so long as somebody always did.